In 1877, the richest man in America lay dying in his Manhattan townhouse. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had built a fortune so vast that no American had ever possessed anything like it. $100 million. In an era before income tax, before inheritance tax, before the government took a single cent from the wealthy. Starting as a 16-year-old ferry boy on Staten Island and ending as the railroad king who controlled more track than some countries possessed. His family gathered around him, his children, his grandchildren, the heirs who would divide what he had spent 70 years building. The Commodore looked at them and saw what he had always seen: weakness. He had called most of his sons blockheads. He had disinherited the ones who disappointed him. He trusted exactly one of his children to protect the empire: William Henry, the quiet one, the one who worked. The Commodore made William Henry promise: keep the fortune together. Don't let them scatter it. Don't let them spend it on nonsense. The railroads must stay unified. The wealth must stay concentrated. Divided among too many heirs, and it would disappear. The old man had seen fortunes vanish before. He knew how fast money could evaporate when fools got their hands on it. William Henry promised. 96 years later, in 1973, 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. They came from across the country: teachers, lawyers, farmers, small business owners, regular Americans with a famous last name. When reporters asked about the legendary Vanderbilt fortune, the answer was stunning. Not a single one of them was a millionaire. $100 million in 1877, worth billions in modern terms. Gone, every last cent, exposed, scattered, vanished into nothing. The Vanderbilts didn't lose their fortune to war. They didn't lose it to revolution or economic collapse or government seizure. They lost it to themselves, to competition between siblings who built palaces trying to outdo each other, to marriages that shipped millions to European aristocrats, to sons who gambled and drank and never learned what work meant, to daughters locked in rooms until they agreed to wed men they didn't love, to taxes that appeared for the first time in American history, designed specifically to prevent families like theirs from accumulating permanent dynasties. To the simple mathematics of division, each generation splitting what remained among more and more heirs until the individual shares couldn't sustain the lifestyle the name demanded. 4 generations. That's all it took. The Commodore built an empire from nothing. His son, William Henry, doubled it to $200 million. William Henry's children spent it on the largest mansions America had ever seen, and their children had nothing left to spend. This is the story of how the richest family in American history destroyed itself. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born on May 27, 1794, on Staten Island, New York. His father was a farmer who operated a small ferry boat on the side, hauling cargo across New York Harbor. The family had nothing. They lived in a modest house near the water, worked long hours, and barely scraped by. Young Cornelius received almost no formal education. He could read and write, but just barely. Numbers were different. Numbers made sense to him. Numbers were power. At 16 years old, Cornelius borrowed $100 from his mother. He used it to buy a small sailing vessel called a Perry Auger, flat-bottomed, single-masted, designed for the shallow waters around Staten Island. He started ferrying passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. The work was brutal. He woke before dawn, worked until after dark, undercut his competitors on price, and fought anyone who tried to take his business. Within a year, he had paid back his mother with interest and bought a second boat. The other ferry operators hated him. He was too aggressive, too hungry, too willing to do whatever it took to win. He didn't just want customers, he wanted all the customers. He slashed prices so low that competitors couldn't survive. When they tried to fight back, he slashed them lower. He would operate at a loss for months if it meant driving someone else out of business. Then, once they were gone, he raised prices again. It was a pattern he would repeat for the next 60 years. By his early 20s, Cornelius had earned enough to attract the attention of Thomas Gibbons, a wealthy steamboat operator who needed someone ruthless to run his New York routes. Gibbons was locked in a legal battle with a state-granted monopoly that controlled all steamboat traffic in New York waters. He needed an operator willing to break the law. Cornelius was willing. He ran Gibbons' boats directly into monopoly territory, daring authorities to stop him. When they tried to arrest him, he evaded capture. When they seized his boats, he bought new ones. The legal battle went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1824, the court ruled in Gibbons' favor, breaking the monopoly forever. Cornelius had learned something important. The law was an obstacle, not a boundary. If you had enough money and enough nerve, you could make the law bend to your will. He reportedly said years later, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" He wasn't asking a question. He was stating a fact. By his 30s, Cornelius owned his own steamboat company. By his 40s, he was one of the wealthiest men in New York. By his 50s, he controlled more shipping routes than anyone in America. People started calling him the Commodore, a naval title he hadn't earned but wouldn't refuse. The name stuck. For the rest of his life, he was the Commodore. Not Cornelius, not Mr. Vanderbilt. The Commodore. As if he commanded a fleet, which, in a way, he did. But steamboats were becoming yesterday's technology. The future was railroads. The Commodore saw it before most of his competitors. In the 1860s, when he was already in his 70s, an age when most men retired or died, he began buying railroad stock. Not small purchases, massive acquisitions. He targeted the New York and Harlem Railroad first, then the Hudson River Railroad, then the mighty New York Central. He fought corporate battles that would have exhausted men half his age. He manipulated stock prices, bribed legislators, crushed rivals through financial warfare that left them bankrupt and broken. By 1870, the Commodore controlled the most valuable railroad network in America. Trains running from New York City to Chicago and beyond, carrying passengers and freight across a nation that was expanding westward at impossible speed. Every train ticket, every cargo shipment, every ton of coal and grain and manufactured goods that moved on his tracks put money in his pocket. The fortune grew faster than he could count it. His personal life was considerably less successful. He had married Sophia Johnson in 1813 when he was 19. They had 13 children together, though several died young. Sophia was quiet and religious, content to stay home, while her husband built his empire. The Commodore barely noticed her. He was too busy working, too obsessed with winning, too convinced that rest was for weaklings. When Sophia died in 1868 after 53 years of marriage, the Commodore remarried within a year. His new wife was Frank Armstrong Crawford, a woman from Alabama who was 45 years younger than him. Society gossiped that she had married him for his money. The Commodore didn't care what society thought about anything. His children were a disappointment. He had 9 sons who survived to adulthood, and he considered most of them useless. Cornelius Jeremiah, his firstborn son, suffered from epilepsy and what the family called nervous disorders. The Commodore gave him an allowance but no real inheritance. He considered the boy damaged goods. George Washington Vanderbilt, another son, showed promise but died young. The others drifted into various pursuits, none of them impressive, none of them worthy of the Commodore's respect. Only one son earned his father's approval. William Henry Vanderbilt was the 4th child, born in 1821. Unlike his siblings, William Henry worked. He started as a clerk in a banking house, then moved into farming, turning a neglected Staten Island property into a profitable operation. The Commodore watched, initially skeptical. Farming was beneath a Vanderbilt, but William Henry made money at it. And making money was the only thing the Commodore truly respected. In the 1860s, the Commodore finally brought William Henry into the railroad business. The son proved capable. More than capable. He was meticulous, patient, and utterly ruthless when required. He was, in short, his father's son. The Commodore's treatment of his other children bordered on cruel. He gave them enough money to survive, but never enough to matter. He made it clear that they were tolerated, not valued. When Cornelius Jeremiah came asking for more money, which he often did, the Commodore berated him publicly. When his daughters married men he considered beneath them, he reduced their inheritances. The message was consistent. Disappoint me and you get nothing. Please me and you might get something. Nobody ever fully pleased him. On January 4th, 1877, the Commodore died at his home on Washington Place in Manhattan. He was 82 years old. The cause was listed as exhaustion, which was probably accurate. He had exhausted himself building an empire. He had exhausted everyone around him trying to maintain it. Now the empire needed a new emperor. The will was read shortly after his death. The content shocked almost everyone, though they shouldn't have. The Commodore left approximately $95 million to William Henry. $95 million out of a total estate of roughly $100 million. His other surviving children divided the remaining scraps. Cornelius Jeremiah received the income from a $200,000 trust fund, which the Commodore considered generous given his son's failures. His daughters received between $250,000 and $500,000 each, substantial sums by normal standards, but insulting compared to what William Henry received. The disinherited children sued. Of course they sued. They claimed the Commodore had been mentally incompetent when he wrote the will, that he had been unduly influenced by William Henry and the new wife, that he couldn't possibly have intended to cut them out so completely. The trial became a public spectacle. Witnesses testified about the Commodore's belief in spiritualism, his consultations with clairvoyants, his conviction that he could communicate with the dead. The press covered every salacious detail. The Vanderbilt name, which the Commodore had spent decades building into a symbol of power, became associated with family dysfunction and courtroom drama. William Henry eventually settled with his siblings to make the lawsuit disappear. He gave them additional millions, not because the court required it, but because the publicity was damaging the family's reputation and, more importantly, the stock price of the railroads. The settlement cost him a fraction of what he had inherited. He could afford it. He could afford almost anything. Before he died, the Commodore reportedly told William Henry to keep the fortune together. Don't divide it among too many heirs. Don't let the grandchildren scatter what took a lifetime to build. The railroads must remain unified. The wealth must remain concentrated. Divided wealth is no wealth at all. William Henry listened. William Henry agreed. William Henry had every intention of following his father's instructions. He didn't. William Henry Vanderbilt took control of the family empire in 1877 and immediately proved himself a worthy successor. Where his father had been aggressive and confrontational, William Henry was strategic and patient. He consolidated the railroad holdings, improved efficiency, invested in expansion. The New York Central system grew more valuable under his management than it had been under the Commodore. The fortune that had been $100 million became $200 million within 8 years. William Henry had doubled the largest fortune in America through careful management and smart investment. But William Henry faced pressures his father never had. The government was beginning to scrutinize railroad monopolies. Journalists were writing about the excessive power of the railroad barons. When a reporter asked William Henry about his obligation to provide service to the public, he snapped, "The public be damned." The quote became infamous. It confirmed everything critics suspected about the arrogance of the wealthy. William Henry apologized, explained, tried to walk it back. The damage was done. The Vanderbilt name now meant contempt for ordinary Americans. More troubling was the strain of managing the empire. William Henry wasn't built like his father. The Commodore had thrived on conflict and stress. William Henry suffered from it. His health deteriorated throughout the early 1880s. He was only in his 60s, but the pressure was aging him rapidly. He began transferring railroad shares to his sons, reducing his own burden while ensuring the family maintained control. He also began thinking about his own will. The Commodore had concentrated the fortune in one heir. William Henry made a different choice. He divided his estate among his 8 children, though not equally. His 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam, received the largest shares, approximately $65 million each. His other children received smaller but still substantial inheritances. His daughters received between $5 and $10 million each. Everyone got something significant. No one got everything. On December 8, 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt sat down in his Fifth Avenue mansion to meet with a railroad executive. During the conversation, he suddenly slumped forward. A massive stroke had killed him almost instantly. He was 64 years old. He had managed the Vanderbilt Empire for just 8 years. In that time, he had doubled the fortune, expanded the railroads, and made the decision that would ultimately destroy everything his father had built. By dividing the estate among his children, William Henry ensured that no single heir would control the family's destiny. He thought he was being fair. He thought he was preventing the kind of bitter will contest that had embarrassed the family after the Commodore's death. Instead, he had done exactly what his father had warned him not to do. He had scattered the fortune, and scattered fortunes, as the Commodore understood, don't survive. The $200 million was now split among 8 heirs. Those heirs would split their shares among their children, and those children would split again. Each generation would have less than the one before. Each generation would face the impossible task of maintaining Vanderbilt standards on shrinking Vanderbilt resources. The mathematics were simple and devastating. The only question was how long it would take for the equation to reach 0. William Henry's children didn't understand this. They couldn't see the future he had accidentally created. They only saw what they had inherited, tens of millions of dollars each. Enough money to build anything they wanted. Enough money to live like royalty. Enough money, they believed, to last forever. The building began before William Henry was cold in his grave. His children had inherited more money than most nations possessed, and they intended to prove it, not through business accomplishments, not through philanthropy or public service, through architecture, through stone and marble and gold leaf applied to walls that no ordinary American would ever see. The Vanderbilt grandchildren were about to transform the American landscape with monuments to their own wealth, and they would bankrupt themselves doing it. Alva Erskine Smith had married William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1875, 2 years before the Commodore died. She was not born wealthy. Her father had been a cotton merchant in Mobile, Alabama, comfortable but hardly aristocratic. The Civil War had destroyed what fortune he had. Alva grew up knowing what it meant to lose everything, and she was determined never to experience that feeling again. When she married William K., as the family called him, she gained access to one of the largest fortunes in America. She intended to use it. The problem was society. Old New York society, the families who had been wealthy for generations, wanted nothing to do with the Vanderbilts. The Commodore had been a ferryman, a rough Staten Island boy who made his money through aggression and sharp dealing. No amount of wealth could erase that origin in the eyes of the Astors and the Livingstons and the other families who considered themselves American aristocracy. Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Jr., known simply as Mrs. Astor, controlled access to New York's highest social circles. Her annual ball invited exactly 400 guests, supposedly the number her ballroom could hold, but really a way of defining who mattered and who didn't. The Vanderbilts were never invited. They didn't matter. Not yet. Alva decided to change that. Her weapon would be a house so spectacular that society couldn't ignore it. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the most prestigious architect in America, to design a French Renaissance chateau on Fifth Avenue at 52nd Street. Hunt had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American to do so. He understood European grandeur in ways that American architects couldn't match. Alva wanted European grandeur dropped onto Manhattan like a challenge. The house took 3 years to build and cost approximately $3 million. It featured a dining room that could seat 200, a gymnasium, and enough spare bedrooms to accommodate an army of guests. The exterior was Indiana limestone carved to resemble a Loire Valley chateau. The interior was filled with tapestries, armor, and artwork that Alva had personally selected during shopping expeditions across Europe. When it was completed in 1882, New Yorkers gathered on Fifth Avenue just to stare at it. Nothing like this had ever existed in America. But a house means nothing without guests. Alva needed to force her way into society, and she devised a plan that was either brilliant or insane, depending on your perspective. She announced that she would host a costume ball on March 26, 1883, to celebrate the completion of her new home. The ball would be the most elaborate party New York had ever witnessed. 1,200 invitations went out. The entire city talked of nothing else for weeks. Newspapers reported on the preparations obsessively. Costume makers worked around the clock to create outfits that would cost thousands of dollars each. Mrs. Astor's daughter Carrie had been rehearsing a special dance number with her friends to perform at the ball. Everyone assumed the Astors would attend. Everyone except the Astors, who hadn't actually been invited. Alva had deliberately withheld their invitation, knowing exactly what would happen. Carrie was devastated. She couldn't perform her dance if she couldn't attend the party. Mrs. Astor, the woman who had spent years excluding the Vanderbilts from society, was forced to make a choice. She could maintain her position and watch her daughter suffer, or she could bend. She bent. Mrs. Astor sent her card to Alva Vanderbilt, the traditional social gesture indicating willingness to receive and be received. It was surrender disguised as courtesy. Alva immediately sent the Astors their invitation. The Vanderbilts were now officially part of New York society. The cost of admission had been a $3 million house and a ball that reportedly ran another $250,000. In today's money, Alva had spent roughly $70 million to get invited to parties. She considered it a bargain. The 1883 ball became legendary. Guests arrived in costumes representing everything from Egyptian princesses to electric lights. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian noblewoman in a Worth gown that cost tens of thousands. The house blazed with light. The food was endless. The dancing continued until dawn. Newspapers covered every detail describing the gowns, the jewels, the decorations, the guest list. The Vanderbilts had arrived, and they had done it through sheer financial force. William K. watched his wife's triumph with something between admiration and concern. The money she had spent was significant even by Vanderbilt standards. But money was for spending, wasn't it? His father had left him $65 million. The income alone from his railroad investments exceeded what most families earned in generations. If Alva wanted to buy her way into society, let her buy. There was always more money. His older brother Cornelius II took a different approach. Where William K. and Alva craved social acceptance, Cornelius II sought respectability. He was the responsible Vanderbilt, the one who actually worked at the railroad business his father and grandfather had built. He married Alice Gwynn in 1867, a woman from a distinguished Ohio family who shared his religious values and charitable instincts. Together, they raised 7 children, attended church regularly, and supported causes like the YMCA and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Cornelius II didn't need to throw spectacular balls. His position was secure. He was the head of the family, the chairman of the New York Central Railroad, the man who carried the weight his siblings refused to bear. But even Cornelius II couldn't resist the competitive pressure. When William K. built his Fifth Avenue chateau, Cornelius II responded with an even larger mansion on Fifth Avenue at 57th Street. Designed by George Post and later expanded by Richard Morris Hunt, the house eventually covered an entire city block. It contained over 130 rooms. It required dozens of servants just to keep it functional. The cost exceeded $10 million by the time all the expansions were complete. It was the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan, and it was intended to demonstrate that Cornelius II remained the senior Vanderbilt, the one whose house literally overshadowed his brothers. The brothers' wives were equally competitive. Alice Vanderbilt was quieter than Alva, less interested in society's approval, but she wasn't about to let her sister-in-law outshine her. When the family summered in Newport, Rhode Island, the competition continued on a smaller but no less intense scale. Newport was where the wealthy escaped New York's summers, building what they called cottages that were actually mansions by any reasonable definition. The Vanderbilts needed cottages appropriate to their station. In 1885, Cornelius II purchased a property in Newport called The Breakers for $450,000. It came with an existing wooden house that was comfortable and respectable. For 7 years, the family summered there without complaint. The original structure suited their needs well enough. It had ocean views, adequate bedrooms, space for entertaining. It was a retreat, not a statement. Then, on November 25, 1892, the house burned down. The family had arrived for an extended Christmas day. A fire started in the kitchen, probably from the stove, though the exact cause was never determined with certainty. The wooden structure caught quickly. The Newport Fire Brigade arrived with horse-drawn equipment, but they couldn't save a timber building once the flames had spread. Cornelius II stood outside with Alice and their daughters, watching helplessly as their summer home collapsed into ash and char. The safes containing Alice's jewelry survived, glowing red from the heat but intact. Everything else was destroyed. For most families, a house fire would be a tragedy requiring insurance claims and modest rebuilding. For Cornelius Vanderbilt II, it was an opportunity. He had watched his brother, William K., build Marble House in Newport, a palace that had cost $11 million and shocked even the wealthy Newport community with its excess. Marble House featured a ballroom lined with gold. It had bronze entrance doors that weighed 10 tons each. It announced William K. and Alva's status in terms that couldn't be misunderstood. Cornelius II had let his brother have that moment. His original breakers had been comfortable, not competitive. But the fire had erased comfort. Now he could build something that would make Marble House look modest. He contacted Richard Morris Hunt within weeks of the fire. Hunt was 65 years old and at the absolute peak of his career. He had designed the Statue of Liberty's pedestal, the Tribune building, the Metropolitan Museum's facade, and more mansions for wealthy clients than he could count. He understood exactly what Cornelius II wanted, not just a house, a statement, a palace that would establish the Vanderbilts as American royalty beyond any possible dispute. The assignment Hunt received bordered on impossible. Design an Italian Renaissance palace based on the great houses of Genoa and Turin. Make it completely fireproof. No wooden beams anywhere in the structure. Steel and stone and marble only. Completed in 2 years, so the family could occupy it for the summer season of 1895. Budget was not a concern. Cornelius II had watched one house burn. He would not watch another. Hunt produced preliminary drawings within 6 weeks. The structure would cover approximately 1 acre of ground, making its footprint larger than most city blocks. The main hall would rise 50 feet to a ceiling painted to resemble an Italian sky. The dining room would feature 12 columns of rose alabaster surrounding a table that seated 34. The materials would come from around the world: marble from Italy and Africa, rare woods from forests on multiple continents, bronze and crystal and platinum for decorative elements. Nothing would be ordinary. Everything would be the finest available. Construction began in the spring of 1893 and continued without pause for over 2 years. At peak activity, reportedly 2,000 workers labored on the site in shifts, some during the day, others through the night under artificial lights. The foundation was blasted out of solid coral, requiring dynamite and massive excavation equipment. The steel frame went up in sections, each piece engineered to support the enormous weight of the stone facade. The Indiana limestone arrived by rail from quarries in the Midwest, massive blocks that required teams of workers and specialized equipment to position. Hunt didn't trust local craftsmen for the most important work. He brought Italian stonemasons across the Atlantic to carve the decorative elements. He commissioned the music room from Allard and Sons in Paris, having them construct the entire room in France, disassemble it, ship it across the ocean in numbered pieces, and reassemble it inside the steel frame in Newport. French artisans spent months fitting panels and moldings into spaces that had been prepared exactly to their specifications. The room came together like an enormous puzzle, every piece machined to tolerances that allowed no error. The costs mounted beyond anything originally planned. $7 million. Perhaps more. Hunt kept no detailed accounts that survived, and Cornelius II didn't seem to care about the exact figure. He wanted perfection, and perfection cost whatever it cost. The morning room alone featured walls covered not in gold leaf as most wealthy clients would have accepted, but in platinum leaf. Alice Vanderbilt had specified platinum because she found its subtle sheen more elegant than gold's brassy brightness. Platinum was rarer and more expensive than gold, but that was precisely the point. Anyone could cover walls in gold. Only the Vanderbilts would cover them in platinum. The breakers was completed in the summer of 1895. Workers were still finishing details in some rooms when the family moved in, but the structure was sound and the main spaces were ready. Hunt had delivered the impossible on schedule. He died in Newport just weeks later, on July 31, 1895, still supervising final touches on what would be his last major commission. The Breakers was his masterpiece. the culmination of a career spent creating monuments for America's new aristocracy. Cornelius II had gotten exactly what he paid for: 70 rooms of marble and platinum, crystal and gold, a great hall that overwhelmed visitors with its scale, a dining room where the chandelier alone contained enough crystal to blind anyone who looked directly at it, bedrooms with bathtubs fed by both fresh water and heated seawater pumped from the Atlantic. Every modern convenience hidden behind Renaissance facades. The house was fireproof, permanent, and absolutely crushing in its assertion of Vanderbilt's supremacy. The tragedy was that Cornelius II barely enjoyed it. In 1896, just 1 year after The Breakers was completed, he suffered a massive stroke at his desk in New York. He was 53 years old. The stroke left him partially paralyzed, unable to work, dependent on Alice and servants for basic tasks. For 3 years he lingered, spending summers at The Breakers, but unable to truly appreciate what he had built. He could walk with assistance. He could speak, though not clearly. He could sit on the loggia and watch the Atlantic crash against the rocks below, but the man who had carried the weight of the Vanderbilt Empire could no longer carry himself. On September 12, 1899, Cornelius Vanderbilt II died of a second stroke at his Manhattan residence. He was 55 years old. He had enjoyed The Breakers in good health for exactly 1 summer. The palace he had built to establish his family's permanent supremacy would now pass to his widow Alice, who would spend the next 35 years trying to maintain what her husband had created. Meanwhile, down in North Carolina, another Vanderbilt was building something even more absurd. George Washington Vanderbilt was the youngest son of William Henry, the quiet intellectual of the family who preferred books to business. He had received a smaller inheritance than his older brothers, only $10 million, which he apparently considered insufficient for his vision. In 1889, he began constructing Biltmore Estate outside Asheville, North Carolina. The house would contain 250 rooms spread across 178,000 square feet, making it the largest private residence ever built in America. The grounds would encompass 125,000 acres, larger than many national parks. George hired Richard Morris Hunt for the architecture and Frederick Law Olmsted for the landscape design. The project consumed years and millions upon millions of dollars. The house required its own railroad spur to deliver materials. It had its own electrical generators, its own water system, its own everything. When completed, Biltmore employed hundreds of workers just to maintain the estate. George had created his own private kingdom in the mountains, a place where he could display his art collection and entertain guests far from the competitive pressures of Newport and New York. The costs nearly broke him. George spent his entire inheritance and then some building and maintaining Biltmore. When he died unexpectedly in 1914 from complications following an appendectomy, his widow discovered that the estate consumed more money each year than it produced. She was forced to sell off most of the original 125,000 acres, keeping only a fraction of what George had assembled. Biltmore survived barely, but only because his widow transformed it into a tourist attraction rather than a private home. The pattern was established. Each Vanderbilt child had inherited tens of millions of dollars. Each had built monuments that cost millions to construct and fortunes to maintain. None of them had considered what would happen when they died, when their own estates were divided among their children, when the mathematics of inheritance finally caught up with the mathematics of upkeep. They built palaces that required empires to sustain. Then they divided the empires among too many heirs. The mansions still stand today. Marble House is a museum. The Breakers is a museum. Biltmore charges admission to tourists who wander through rooms that once hosted private parties for the wealthiest families in America. The stone and marble have survived. The fortunes that built them have not. The houses became too expensive for even the families who constructed them. They endure only because they were given away or sold to organizations that could generate revenue from public curiosity.